Hey, everybody, welcome to another edition of Think Your Way to an Epic Life. Today, Andrea is going to enlighten us about the 5 indicators of belonging. It is fascinating, and it's all about your brain and the chemistry that happens in your brain, whether you do belong, whether you don't belong, and how you, by yourself, can actually find belonging. Check it out. I hope you enjoy. Andrea, thank you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Kara. I'm excited to be here today. Let's
Oh
dig in.
gosh, let's do it. Let's have some fun. And do you think that we belong together?
Absolutely. For a number of reasons, and I'll dig into them today. I've spent the better part of 20 years studying what makes people feel deeply engaged with their work and their lives. Um, while others who are in the same exact circumstances feel deeply detached, depleted, invisible. And what I've discovered about belonging really changed everything for me. I usually do a lot of corporate work. And today, what I was really excited about doing is changing how people think about belonging, because most people think about belonging as fitting in, being accepted by a group, finding your people. I hate that. I hate hearing find your people. That's not what the research actually shows. Okay. So we're going to dig into why belonging is actually something that's fundamental. There are 5 conditions that your nervous system actually requires for you to function. And when I say function, I don't just mean survive, right? I mean specific neurochemical brain states that actually allow you to build something and create something and live a life that feels epic rather than exhausting. And I think in today's world, that's something that a lot of people need to hear about.
Girlfriend, that is exciting. I mean, very, very exciting. So you're saying don't try and have another human fill you, fill yourself.
Well, what I'm saying is that there is a structure to this. And so these 5 conditions literally change what's happening in your brain and your body. So in organizations, when we talk about building teams, when we talk about creating culture, when we talk about bringing people together so that people can engage, go quickly together, so speed, quality, innovation, retention, like those are kind of the big topics I normally talk about. And what's fascinating about that is that, people always say, well, what do we do if we're not getting that right away? And most of us wait for everybody to do it for us, right? I want you, Kara. You do it first, and then I'll do it second, right? Like I'll show up if you show up.
Sure.
But these 5 conditions literally change what's happening in your brain and body, so that even if you don't have the environment that's giving you 50% to start, you learn how to create it. And I think that's something that we really have to learn how to do, because it's not just this metaphorical element of think it and it will happen, right? It's measurable brain chemistry. It's cortisol levels, it's oxytocin production, it's dopamine, serotonin systems, it's your amygdala threat response, it's your prefrontal cortex being able to plan, strategize, execute. And one of the things that I will also say is that because I have 2 neurodivergent kids who are now in their teens, one just turned 18, the other one's 15. This also works with teenagers. And so it really is something that 5 years ago, I was validating this research. 3 years ago, I started my meta analysis. I've now worked across 8 industries. I've worked with over 150,000 employees. And we can measure belonging in environments, in organizations, in communities, in schools, and even in families.
Woo! Okay, you gave me enough to unpack for 20 podcasts, right? So first and foremost, can you please define neurodivergent?
So neurodivergent is actually a term that's used often in, I would say, in the therapy and in the educational world. It's becoming more common. It's essentially an umbrella, or a wheel is a better way of identifying it. It handles everything from ADHD and ADD, dyslexia, autism, all the way to sensory elements that you know, increase anxiety and can even lead to, varying degrees of depression. So when we talk about neurodivergent, it really is a wheelhouse. And what it essentially means is that the brain is not typical. And so things that are taught in typical schools for typical brains, those people will thrive, whereas people who are neurodivergent, they will struggle to thrive. And so that's also part of that environmental learning conundrum that we've been talking about for years and years. And so the neuroscience was my initial way of unpacking why some people succeed in sometimes epic ways and others really just scrape by. Yeah. And so what I discovered was that the same brain requirements that predict performance in organizations also predict whether or not you can build an epic life.
Okay, so man, I tell you, I want to put that off a little because I'm so hungry for it. Like what are the 5 things? What are the 5 things? But I do want to ask you this because when you started talking, Brene Brown once said that she felt like she was an outsider in her own family, and when she went to everybody in her family, they all felt like they were outsiders in their own family. How common 100%. Is that?
Yeah, it's very common. It's very common. It's also one of the reasons why right now in North America, our estrangement rates are 1 and 2. It's the highest it's ever been. And so, if we look at, and I would say I feel the exact same way as Brene Brown, and I would say that my family is likely in the same, coming from the same perspective. Let me tell you a little bit about how I got here, because I think the journey does matter. So I think I mentioned 20 years ago, I was studying, neuroscience, performance coaching. I was really working with executives, helping them get better results, optimize leadership, hit those goals. Classic performance frameworks. But I couldn't explain that if we had 2 leaders in the same company, with similar roles, same resources, one would thrive and the other one was burning out. Like, why was that? And when I started asking, what's happening in their brains and bodies that's different, originally I thought it had to do with gender, right? Like, it took me deep into the neuroscience and I wanted to understand those actual mechanisms, not just why certain people feel stressed, but what stress is actually doing in the brain and why, they feel unseen, like we had just talked about, and what's happening neurochemically when you feel invisible. That's a really big problem, a really big thing to unpack. And so when you feel chronically uncertain, your amygdala, which is your brain's threat system, it stays activated, it stays on, and it floods your system with cortisol. And elevated cortisol will eventually shut down your prefrontal cortex. So your thinking, planning, executing part of your brain. It's also your creative brain. So when you can't think positively out of something, it's because your planning brain or your thinking brain is actually offline. It's not because there's something wrong with you. And what I learned was that when you feel invisible or unvalued, the oxytocin, which is your bonding hormone, that actually drops and your cortisol rises. And so when you can't bond and you can't feel calm and you can't feel safe without it, what do? You withdraw, right? You become more and more invisible. And that actually lowers your oxytocin even more. And so it's that whole element of, well, you're not showing up for me, so I'm not going to show up for you. And then it becomes a very vicious neurochemical cycle. And I've also learned that, when you work hard, but you can't see your impact, your dopamine and serotonin, they which are supposed to play off of each other, they actually flatline. And so dopamine is what motivates. Serotonin is actually the chemical that regulates your sense of worth. It keeps you going, right? So one activates and motivates, and the other one keeps you filled, like it has a tank of gas. And so without visible evidence that your actions are actually creating outcomes, both systems, they essentially go, nah, nothing you do matters. Why bother? And that's not psychology, that's actually biology.
Right.
And so that's actually what led me to the industrial organizational psychology, where I then went in to validate scientifically across thousands of people, because it wasn't until I validated it with my initial sample size that was 3,500 participants, 13 Toronto Stock Exchange listed companies in the mining industry. So think about that. That I then, really started to see a pattern repeating itself. And that was that even though the sample size of that 3,500 study was predominantly men, because mining is predominantly still dominated by men. In this sample, it was 75% men. The one factor that really showed whether somebody belonged or didn't belong was actually whether or not they were an executive.
Huh. That's
And that was fascinating to me, because at the time we were also going through, many, many studies on DEI, and in Canada we call it IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, because accessibility is one of our big factors as well. And it wasn't until we started seeing that there was also a lot of men saying, I don't belong in these male dominated fields, right? That we had to think, okay, we have to go further. What else is happening? And so that led to, working with many more companies, 150,000 plus employees. And what emerged was really the belonging first methodology. And that was, yeah.
I can't take it anymore. Drum roll, drum roll. Hit us. What did all that study produce for you? What did you find out that was surprising?
Yeah, so there was actually 5 neurological, I'll call them neurological requirements. In the workplace, we call them indicators, because there's behaviors and skills that go with them. But for this podcast, and really for the audience who's listening today, I want you to think of these as, when all 5 of these are present and working together, you have the brain chemistry and the neural activation patterns that will allow you to build, create, and sustain meaningful work. And I think that that's what your audience is really looking for, right? They often come to listen to your podcast for that. And so even when you're missing one of these, your nervous system shifts into a different state. And that state is one that blocks your ability to create your future. So the 5 indicators, the first one is comfort. Now, comfort isn't like your environment has to be, without conflict, or, it has to all feel good, because let's be real, our environments are not that right now. So comfort is actually what allows your brain to calm down. And what you need in order for your brain to have comfort is you actually need to have some clarity, and you have to have some predictability. And you can actually create those for yourself. We'll get into that after I've gone through the 5 indicators. So what comfort does when you have clarity and predictability is it reduces your cortisol, and it allows your prefrontal cortex to function. Connection is the second indicator. This is the indicator that causes your brain to release oxytocin, connect with people, bond, lowers your stress response. Connection is really about being known and getting to know others and getting to know what you need in order for you to succeed.
So I hate to just interrupt and just drop a completely off the wall question here, but so many people connect with their dogs. Does that count?
Yep. It does, and I'll show you how once we actually go through them. Yeah, for sure. Because I do think that there's connection is something you need connection, and you can find connection even within yourself. And so these are things that we often underestimate. And so animals are obviously going to produce oxytocin because they are unconditional love. And a lot of people have never experienced that. So absolutely. Think of connection. The big factor for connection is that your relationships cannot be transactional. So they have to be about trust. So what you've just said there, Kara, absolutely makes sense, when you're talking about an animal, because you can build trust with an animal that's definitely not transactional, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So just to kind of get in there just a little bit, people pleasers in general, you're either performing or you're in a relationship.
Well, it's not as simple as that. We're going to break it down a little bit more, because all of these indicators can be incredibly complex, but they can also be super simple. So today we're going to keep them super simple, and I'm going to give you language that allows you to see. And I'm also going to give you a place where you can check how much you're giving and how much you're receiving. And that can also be with yourself.
Okay.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Your relationship with yourself is a mirror of your relationship, or I should say that your relationship with others is a mirror of your relationship with yourself. So yeah. And you can't love more than you love yourself.
Yeah. And a lot of that is conditional, right? So if you look at how you were raised, likely you were labeled whatever that label is. And so if you were labeled in a way that you don't associate with, or you don't love, or you don't feel like you actually are that, that actually creates a completely different internal narrative that you actually can shift, so that when you go into different environments, you can actually create that for yourself. Contribution. Yeah, let's go into the third one, contribution. Yeah. So contribution is what activates dopamine for motivation and serotonin for self-worth. Contribution is your giving and receiving within any given environment. So at work, it's like you matter as a human being, and the work that you're doing is, you can see how it's actually moving the business forward. In relationships and family, you know that you matter because you're considered before plans are made. You're considered in how you're approaching problems. You're considered where you can influence a decision. And that's a big deal in families and communities. So we'll leave it as that. Psychological safety. So psychological safety is like it's protecting, but it's also understanding that you're not going to be punished socially for things that you say or do. So psychological safety is what keeps people willing. It keeps people willing to speak, to try, to admit, to fail, to challenge. And when you know you're not going to be socially punished if you try something and fail, it keeps you engaged, keeps you showing up, right?
Yeah.
And then well-being. Well-being is what actually regulates your sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. Well-being is a really interesting concept right now, because there's a lot of organizations who are like, oh, we're going to give you an app and you can bounce back on your own. Or here, we'll do this resilience training and you go figure it out. It's 100% on you. but we're not creating conditions for well-being, which means that if you can't bounce back and you're not resilient, then guess what? It's all your fault. And so too bad you don't fit here.
Yeah.
And so when we look at these, the thing that I think is really important to understand is that it's all an element of 50-50. So fitting in means that 100% of the responsibility for you to feel good is held within you to adjust, to change, to shapeshift into what your environment wants of you and what they've labeled you as. Belonging means that your environment wants you to succeed as much as you want to succeed. And so they're going to co-create 50-50 with you. Is that clear?
Very,
Very,
very
great. So why don't we start with comfort as a bit of a story here. I want to tell you about an executive named Maya. And, Maya was a person who woke up every day with her stomach in knots. Her job was meh, she always said, oh, it's fine. But there was always a ton of uncertainty. Her relationship, she would always say it's mostly good, despite living with somebody who made her question commitment daily. And everything in her life was really vague. So every morning, her brain kept running the same loop. And every time she came to me, we would talk about, well, what am I going to do if I lose my job? What's going to happen to me if he leaves? What are we going to do if everything falls apart? Like those were literally her three questions. And she was getting to a place where she was becoming so paralyzed that she wasn't able to plan, to make decisions, and she was having a really hard time focusing. And here's what was happening inside her brain. It was like, from a comfort perspective, that amygdala was just activated by all of the uncertainty. And when your amygdala can't predict what's coming next, it essentially is interpreting all of that ambiguity, all of those what ifs as danger. And so it continues to just trigger all that cortisol, right? And so your amygdala, your adrenal glands, they're just in primary stress mode. And in the short term, it's helpful because it will mobilize energy to deal with immediate threat. But if you're constantly in that, so months turn into years, that chronic cortisol of not having any sort of clarity or predictability, that actually becomes responsible for decreasing your executive functioning. And so when that cortisol is, chronically elevated and you're just not able to access your highest thinking, those people that are like, no, I'm super smart. What's going on? Why can I not figure this out? Why is life not going the way that I want it to be going? There's nothing wrong with you. It's your brain is stuck in a state that made planning impossible. And so Maya kept waiting for comfort to arrive, right? She was like, someday he's going to propose and everything will be okay. Or someday all of these changes that are happening in my industry will stop and we'll be able to just grow. And both of those things, even just saying that out loud, have uncertainty around them. There's no real clarity or predictability. And there certainly isn't a way for you to tell whether or not you're going to be successful. And so we can't keep waiting for comfort to arrive. And so what I asked her was, well, what if you could start changing your brain chemistry yourself so that you could start initiating better thinking, better actions? You can start doing the things that are actually really important for you or to you that you're excited about. And so it was a matter of just sitting down and saying, okay, let's get really clear on this. What is the role that you want in your organization? And how will you know that your contributions actually matter? What are your success factors that you can automatically look for and you can start creating? What's the relationship element where you know that there's some sort of certainty that you could ask, am I building a relationship by myself, or are we creating something together? And even looking at like savings and putting a specific number to what is it that I need to write down that I know that I will have in savings that is going to calm my brain so that once I have that, I have predictability, I have clarity, and I know that I've achieved the goal. Right. So that's not positive thinking. That's actually neuroscience. And it's your brain having explicit clarity. And so when you're going through massive change that you have no control over, the big thing that you want to do to get you from this space of I'm uncertain, I'm living in uncertainty, and therefore everything around me is dangerous. You can say to yourself, okay, I'm living in uncertainty, but I can put a plan together so that I know what is certain, and I know what I can depend on, and I know what I can predict. And that distinction actually really matters because it's the difference between your brain staying in threat scanning and being able to go, okay, this isn't perfect, but I can build and I can solve and I can move through action. So with Maya, we created her like Monday mapping. That was her big thing that like was really helpful, where she wrote down 3 specific priorities, and it was just for the week, and she knew that she could control them. And why that worked was because, your amygdala needs those predictability patterns. And as soon as it knows that it's coming, it actually takes you into flooding the system with being able to relax. And the counter to cortisol kicks in, and it means that you can actually think through things. So prefrontal cortex comes right back online. And it meant that for Maya, suddenly she could be clear, she could assign new work, she could evaluate strategically. And instead of that anxiety continuing to build and nag at her, she had that neurochemistry just of comfort. And so your 50% of comfort is when you're providing your own clarity through your explicit declarations. You're creating predictable patterns for yourself, and you're speaking safety cues to your amygdala. We can get to some of those. Your environment giving you 50% is when your prefrontal cortex is online. You can recognize those opportunities. You can make those strategic decisions when they come to you and make the right choice. And you can actually build towards what you're declaring. When you are not showing up, the environment can't show up for you.
That was step 1.
Step 1.
Step 2.
So step 2, oxytocin. So this is where we go into looking at more of that bonding concept. And this is where we'll circle back to the experience with animals as well, because we talked about oxytocin being called the bonding hormone. It is proactively released during social interactions, physical touch, acts of care. And for people who have been conditioned or have grown up in environments where that wasn't the case for them. So maybe you grew up in social isolation. Maybe you grew up not being told that your environment was safe. Maybe you even grew up in spaces where there was physical or emotional harm. So that actually indicates that your nervous system is used to spiraling. right? It's used to also going into the flip side of that, where you're not going to depend on anybody else. And we are still human beings, and so we still need interdependency. And so the breakthrough discovery, I think, from neuroscience is that what's fascinating is that your brain can't actually distinguish validation from someone else versus validation from yourself.
How much power is that?
That alone, like when you think about that alone, it means that you can speak to yourself with care, with recognition, and you're activating the same part of the brain that provides caregiving. And so that same oxytocin can be released, and that same cortisol can be lowered, and your brain can go through this value of um, experiencing or believing that you only get value from others, which would have been predisposed when you were a child or younger, into building neural pathways that actually allow you to experience it so that you know what it's like when it shows up for you. And you can do it for yourself.
So what would be one of the best ways to do it for yourself? And the big question that I'm getting at is, should it be statements to yourself or should it be questions to yourself? Because your brain will give you an answer.
Yeah, and you know, this is one of those things that you know, I certainly think both work. And here's why. I think it's important when you are trying to establish connection with yourself that you're actually transparent with what you're going through. And so I think a lot of people go to trying to make something positive when actually it's a really tough situation. And in not negating that it's a tough situation, you're actually lying to your brain, and your brain knows that you're lying. So saying something to the effect of, that was a really hard day. I see how much you tried. It's okay that you're exhausted. You're not alone. What can I do now? So we go from statement into, what can I do now that actually is going to make me feel alive? What's going to make me feel like I can keep going? And those statement, acknowledgement into questioning, and just like you said, Kara, like it's like your brain that answers that. It can even be, I had one really interesting statement just recently from somebody who said, Andrea, based on what you've taught me, what I start doing is I start asking myself, how am I feeling today? And in just asking, because that person had been through so much trauma that they actually didn't know what they were feeling or when. So it was like they couldn't actually even identify when things were getting too hard or when their system was going to be triggered so that they had to opt out. And if we look at the estrangement and we look at the lack of trust that we have right now, when we look at toxicity levels in the US in the workplace, they went from 66% last year to 80% toxic this year. That's a massive growth.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Growth.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What years are we talking? 2024, 2025?
Yes.
Holy cow.
20 from 2024. So 2024 measured at 66%. 2025 measured at 80%.
Oh, makes you
Yeah.
want to go get a job, right?
well, all of those elements all come together. And so I think what happens, especially now, is that we're bombarded by everything going on in the world. Social media has made everything so accessible. And in some ways that's good. And in some ways it means that we can't ever shut off. And so because of that, I'm sharing this specifically because I found it so interesting that this person came to me and said, I actually need to ask myself, what am I feeling today before I ask myself what I need? And that was also just a really big light bulb moment right now in where we are in the world at this point in time. And so I think when hard things happen, saying to yourself, okay, Andrea, I see myself going through this. I get it. I see that this is happening. I see that this is hard. How am I feeling today? What is it that I need today? And that this isn't a big thing. It doesn't take you a ton of time to do this. But the more you do that, the more you give your brain comfort, clarity, and predictability, because you're asking yourself and you're training yourself and you're giving yourself structure that allows you to create those bonds within your own brain so that you can then start looking for how you're creating that within your environment.
All right. Okay. Very good. Okay. 2 is done. 1 is done. That leaves us 3, 4, and 5. What do we got for number 3?
Yeah, so 3 is our dopamine, serotonin, its contribution. When we talk about dopamine and serotonin, so important for you to look at it like dopamine is your reward system, right? It's released when you check a box. That's why all of those games that we play on our phones, they have a specific noise. And they actually did a lot of research on what noise would trigger dopamine in our brain for us to keep wanting to play. Crazy, right?
Kind of
It's
like our
also
food,
why,
right?
true, very true. It's also why in your teams or in certain applications where you're putting your lists together and you click it and it has a little check mark and a bing that goes off, that's also a dopamine release, right? So it's the reward system where when you accomplish something, when you reach a goal, when you experience success, it drives motivation. It makes you want to keep going. Now, serotonin is what helps you sustain satisfaction. It helps you regulate your self-worth. It's what makes you feel like your life has meaning and like you matter. So here's the thing about this, and how this works is that the brain is also always looking for evidence. And your brain can't produce a dopamine or a serotonin based on effort alone. It actually needs visible proof. So for people who are very into manifestation or dreaming up their perfect lives, there is a lot of research that actually shows that if you can give your brain evidence, you can actually create that much faster. And from a practical perspective, I think of one of my first contracts that I had with this one woman who was working like 100 hours a week, which is crazy and massive effort, but she never tracked what actually changed because the effort was always the big thing for her. And so her brain was getting zero evidence. And when there's no evidence, dopamine flatlines, you lose motivation. Why am I even here? Why am I even trying? Serotonin drops, you question your worth. Nothing I do even matters. Nobody even pays attention. So here's Lisa, 100 hours per week. And, she was just dying to be validated and waiting for people to thank her, waiting for people to recognize her, waiting for external sources to provide the evidence that, her brain really needed. And when we started to flip the switch, it was like, okay, well, what if you could provide evidence for yourself? And we talk about this a lot in our performance reviews, one-on-ones, where it's like, instead of putting everything onto your manager, your leader to give you your evidence, you create the conditions of what you need in order for you to see the evidence of your impact. So, for example, it might be something like, I did this and this happened. And that's enough for your brain to actually go, okay, you have the evidence that you need. So every Friday, then it's like reviewing what did you do and counting those outcomes. Well, actually, so for this specific person, she actually had to count how many things she had impacted. And what was crazy, you can imagine 100 hours of work. By the time she started looking at where there was measurable outcomes and where her impact had impacted other people or the work itself, she was in like within the first month, it was like hundreds of outcomes that she had impacted and wasn't even realizing that that's what was happening. So when we look at that, serotonin isn't about immediate rewards, it's about sustained reward. And so this is where we're seeing so many people burning out, because if the brain isn't receiving that serotonin message, that your work matters, that you matter, that's where people are opting out. And we're seeing that a lot with our great detachment, where people are staying in roles, but they're not necessarily doing anything anymore. So we're seeing, this slowing of success within the world right now. So remember that 50-50, right? So document your outcomes, track some cause and effect. It's as simple as that. And give yourself dopamine and serotonin systems evidence that they need. And then your environment, when that motivation system is online, your sense of worth is stable. And it means that you'll start producing meaningful work without necessarily all of that external recognition right away. But then because you build that internal foundation, it all starts to show up as well. So change your brain chemistry first, your environment will follow.
This is beautiful. I can't wait for the book. Number 4.
Number 4, psychological safety. So when we think about psychological safety, I think we've talked about, how it's our protection. And if your amygdala has learned from past experiences, from cultural messages, from your own self-talk, which is often harsh, right? Imperfection becomes really dangerous. So, we have all of this, billions of dollars went into psychological safety training. Same with resiliency training. And I don't mean to laugh because it's not funny, but it's a lot of money being poured into training that hasn't actually considered how people think and how people think internally first. And so if every single time somebody considered saying, I don't know, or I made a mistake, the amygdala is going to detect that, this is a threat. Your environment is a threat. You're being judged. You're being rejected. You're going to be punished. It's going to continue to releasing cortisol and adrenaline, right? So this is where we see a lot of that anxiety, biological responses. So heart rate increasing, palms getting sweaty, your body tensing up. And what happens there is that brain imaging actually shows that when there's a decrease of connectivity between those regions that are under that perceived social threat, that prefrontal cortex, we know that shuts down, right? You're not problem solving, you're not strategically thinking, you're not doing your best work. But when you're waiting for the environment to prove it's safe, then what happens is that we're always looking for the threat, right? And so what we have to start doing is actually giving ourselves permission to feel safe first, so that we then start providing that for ourselves. And this is where you can give yourself explicit verbal permission. So you're sending direct messages to your amygdala. It's okay if I fail today. It's okay if I try something today. It's okay for me to show up and challenge something. I give myself permission to make mistakes and learn. Sometimes that one is the biggest one, especially if you're in environments where you're expected to be perfect, or you're expected to know the answer all the time, right? And so those are some explicit cues that when you say it out loud, it can't be an internal voice. You have to say it out loud. It's safe to be imperfect. You're literally reprogramming your threat detection system, and you're allowing new information to change the way that you respond. And so over time, your amygdala learns, okay, being authentic or being my best self doesn't actually result in punishment. And you can start decreasing that threat response. We also kind of look at it through the lens of like, what's a curious response? And so starting by saying, it's okay for me to not have all the answers today. But then you can also ask with a follow-up question, what is it that I'm actually afraid of if I don't have the answer? Right. And so, Kara, just like you had said earlier, where it was, what's the statement, but what's the question? And so this is where just asking some simple or making some simple statements really does change this. And what's fascinating is that we've been tracking a lot of our male leaders, and a lot of men have a really big fear of being wrong. And so they often will shut things down out of fear, not out of, that it could work. It's that they don't have the answer. And so they don't want to be perceived as wrong. And so they're criticizing their internal self so that nobody else can do it outside. And they're dysregulating the room because they're not regulating themselves. So this is something we've actually been tracking a lot of. And what was fascinating is that confidence levels that were plummeting all of the sudden started to return. And so, kind of what we're seeing is about 8 weeks on average, people are returning to confidence, being asked for an opinion and saying, you know what, I need to think about that a little bit more. Can I get back to you? And instead of it taking you out on a whole day of then saying, oh, I didn't say the right thing, or, obviously there's not enough evidence where I'm doing something good. People around you start saying, I really appreciate that you needed more time and that you told me that so that we can make the right decision. I really appreciate that you're showing up in a different way and it's allowing us to work through things. And so there's no punishment there. There's acceptance there. And so then the amygdala actually registers, hey, wait a second, because I didn't predict, I wasn't wrong, and being authentic didn't result in any threat. It just allowed me to update my model that it's okay for me to say, I don't know.
And authenticity is the most attractive thing in a person. It truly is. And it's something to shoot for, guys. So we're down to the last and final
last one. Well-being. So this is all about your sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. So fight, flight, freeze, or faint. Those are all 4 of them. When you are experiencing them, adrenaline, cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, all of the hormones are going crazy, right? So increased heart rate. It also sharpens your focus, which is an interesting thing. Mobilizes energy in the moment. But when that is constantly going, right, it's only designed for short-term activation, right? So we're talking half an hour. When it's under long periods of time, days, weeks, months, years, that's where your body starts to fail. And not belonging is actually like smoking a pack of cigarettes per day based on what happens to your physical body and your anatomy, which is amazing. And so when we look at parasympathetic nervous system, which is, the rest, digest, it lowers your heart rate, brings everything back from your sympathetic nervous system, helps you consolidate memory as well. So for people who are really struggling with remembering things, it's because your parasympathetic nervous system has been offline for too long. Regulates your emotions, allows your body to restore. So when you think of those kind of 2 opposing elements of biology, if your system is always stuck on it's just constantly going, it's where you're waking up and you're automatically checking email. It's where you're getting out of bed and you're immediately reaching for your phone. What happened in the news? It's where you are lying in bed at night and you can't, your mind isn't going, but your body can't shut off enough for you to naturally fall asleep. So you need something to actually allow you to fall asleep. And when we are engaging our sympathetic nervous system for too long, your recovery system learns that it can't turn on. And so then it stops turning on. And that's how that cortisol levels are chronically activated. And so if your body thinks it's constantly under attack, your body is breaking down. And so when we look at well-being, and when we look at, the need to have consideration for your parasympathetic nervous system, we have to start setting up some boundaries around when we are going to recover. And what that means is being able to set boundaries so that you allow for that parasympathetic activation and you start scheduling your recovery. It's also one of those things within the organization where we say, okay, so if you're going to give me more, you're going to put more on my plate. What are you taking off my plate? Where's our priorities focusing? Because I'm already working this amount of hours. And so putting more on isn't actually going to allow me to be sustainable, for me to be creative, for me to go with speed and quality. We need to actually readjust what's happening here. And that doesn't mean that you don't succeed. It means that you get really strategic about what we're doing. It also means that we're not sending emails in the middle of the night or 6 a.m. or midnight or whatever that is. It means that maybe your time to do your work or do your emailing is between 8 and 10. All of us have, other things outside of the office. And so it's okay. So if I'm going to write this and I'm going to do this work, then I then make sure that I'm scheduling it so that it goes out at a time that's acceptable, right? And you're considering other people. And if that's your window, if you're doing 8 to 10 at night, then what can you add in at a different time so that you're still recovering? Is that meaning that you're going to get your exercise in the morning? Does that mean that you get some extra sleep in the morning? Are you maybe a morning person and you do everything in the morning, and so at night you're not looking at your emails after 8 o'clock? You're putting some boundaries in place so that you're regulating your nervous system, and you're ensuring that all 5 of those elements are recognized, because they're deeply interconnected. And when all 5 are working together, you have lower responses to threat, strategic thinking, bonded and safe, motivated and worthy, activated, and you can recover.
That
So
sounds beautiful.
yeah,
It does. You've worked with all these people, and when you work with one person, how many people does that really impact?
well, and that's the cool part about the 50-50, is that that 50-50 doesn't stop with you. It continues to ripple out.
Mhm.
And that's part of that partnership. So changing your neurochemistry first, and then allowing your environment and your people to respond differently, that can actually completely change dysregulated nervous systems.
Thank you so much for just dumping this incredible amount of information and wisdom on us, and wish you the best of luck. Keep doing what you're doing, because you are making the world a better place.
Thank you so much, Kara. It's been a pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Oh gosh, me too. Talk to you soon.